Now, in 1912, money was sent from New Zealand to build a school here in Guilin village. Unfortunately, in 1919, a bandit raid saw the school ransacked, virtually destroyed. So it was relocated a little bit later in the Wong ancestral hall here. And more New Zealand money came, such that the school had really good facilities, had great teachers. It was, in fact, the top school in the county. And some New Zealand children were sent back here for their education, including my old friends from Dunedin, Bill and George Wong. They were educated in this very building. This was their grandfather's village. They had a great time here, swimming in the river, their grandfather's lychee orchard across the way there. Their memories were fantastic of their boyhood spent here in their home village of Guilin and educated in this school.
Oh, look, everything looks strange. Everything different. But you just keep quiet, and after a while you get to know something.
Bill and George did very well during their 6 years at the Guilin school, and their teachers were very keen for them to go on to higher education. But the family was worried. The prospects in Guangdong, the threat of invasion by the Japanese, they thought it would be safer for the boys to return to New Zealand. So their grandmother raised a loan for their fares. In 1936, back they came. They immediately began working in shops and market gardens so they could quickly repay the loan for their grandmother, which they did by 1939. And in that year, George found this shop in Cargill's Corner, Dunedin, and they took out a lease and they began operating Wong Brothers. Now that fruit shop was an institution here in South Dunedin until 1990, when the boys retired as grand old men, having served the community here for years and years. Both of the Wong brothers served in the armed forces during the war. Bill joined the New Zealand Scottish Regiment, where he was affectionately known as Billy Mac Wong. Later he became a pilot in the Air Force and is honoured in this beautiful mural painted on the side of the Dunedin Public Art Gallery. A third brother, James, also came back and forth from China, but his path was very different to Bill and George's. I'm here in Guilin at the grave of James Wong. Now, James Wong is a Dunedin man. He's a King's High School old boy. He went to Otago University, Dunedin Teachers College, taught various schools around Otago. But he was very committed to China. And unlike most New Zealand Chinese in the 1950s, he was prepared to embrace the new regime in place here. So he dedicated his life to the advancement of Chinese affairs, both here in China and back in New Zealand. Now, in his last years, as he was dying from cancer, his son brought him back to China and he died here. And in recognition of his great efforts on behalf of the Chinese state, the government buried him with honour, developing this Feng Mu here in Guilin for Dunedin man James Wong. One of the better known stories from the Dunedin Chinese community is that of Peter Chin. From humble beginnings and through diligent public service, he would rise to become Mayor of Dunedin.
Prior to 1940, I think there was only probably about a handful of Chinese women in the whole of New Zealand. And then when wives came and joined with their husbands, suddenly everybody had children, and Chinese were pretty good breeders those days. It was one every year for several years. So most of those families either had fruit shops, laundries, market gardens, and they were all family businesses where the children really grew up as part of the business of the family.
Suriname is actually the name for a grouping of villages. About 14 little villages make up Suriname. One of those is Sui Poi, just off to my left. Now, Sui Poi is where Peter Chin's family comes from. His father, Chin Moonok, had been in Dunedin for a long time. So when the Japanese invaded Guangdong, his mother was one of those who was allowed to come to New Zealand as a refugee with his older siblings. So they made their way from here down to Hong Kong and over to New Zealand to safety. And for the next 6 or so years, they were there on a very limited basis. Chin Moon Ok had to pay a substantial bond for his wife, and he had also to sign a letter every year promising that any children born while she was with him in New Zealand would at the end of the conflict have to go back home to Sui Poi. Now that included Peter Chin, and he actually had this sword of Damocles hanging over his head as a small boy, unbeknown to him of course, but well known to his mother and father. And it wasn't until after the Second World War when the Chinese were finally allowed to stay permanently and those restrictions were lifted that Peter Chin was safe to become the New Zealander that he ended up being.
And so the immigration rules were loosened, I suppose, to allow family reunification. So through that process, my mother came to join with my father, and a whole lot of Chinese women came in the late 1930s, late 39, 40, 41, over those years.
So this is Peter Chin's childhood home here at 13 Scotland Street, just up above the main business district of Dunedin. Here he grew up with his many sisters. His father, Chin Moon Ok, the laundryman, had purchased this property off the Lo Keong family, so there's quite a continuity there of historic Chinese personalities in Dunedin here in Scotland Street. Peter's family was a prime example of the evolution Chinese families went through during the post-war period. The Chins were originally laundrymen, but they later branched into different ventures in order to keep their finances strong.
Well, it was very much, I suppose, a family business in the laundry in those early days. It was a 6-day-a-week business that they were always there. If clothes weren't being washed, they were being dried, they were being ironed, and everybody chipped in. And I have memories as a wee kid standing on a box in the ironing table, ironing handkerchiefs. Not very well, but or ironing butcher's aprons, because in those days, this is before the days of nylon and things like that. So the linen aprons, etc., they took a hell of a lot before you can burn anything. So by pushing these heavy irons around, so you were very much part of. It was a family business in that true sense. And then when my father decided that he wasn't going to be able to bring up 6 kids running a laundry, because by the late 40s, early 50s, the dry cleaning business was more in vogue. So the old style of Chinese laundries were very much kind of dying out, and so he decided he'd take on a fish and chip shop, about which he knew nothing, but the shop that he had was the Octagon Fish, which is basically where the main entrance to Forsyth Bar House now is. My sisters and I, as we kind of grew older, were part of that business in that we peeled potatoes and made chips. We learned to open oysters, to fillet fish, to then serve and to do all those things. So the work ethic was very much part of it, because we knew nothing else. That was that was life, and that was the extent of everything we did.
Peter became an accomplished singer and actor. In 1988, he landed a role in a film focusing on the hardships of Chinese in the gold seeker era. There's just so many varieties of terrain in inland Otago. This is another beautiful but very barren and desolate looking landscape. Conroy's Gully, not far from Alexandra. Not too far back behind me here is the illustrious Energy Reserve. That's named after a film made in 1988 by Leon Nabi, a New Zealand filmmaker, which focused on the lifestyle of the Chinese gold seekers. It was a brilliant film. If you really want to get a sense of what life was like for a little party of Chinese miners in the 19th century, you can't go far wrong in looking at illustrious Energy. Another little aspect of it that's of interest to us in Dunedin is that the future Dunedin mayor, then just a humble lawyer in his own firm, was Peter Chin. He plays a part in the film. Now Peter, of course, has got links to previous generations and goes back to Guangdong in his whakapapa. And this landscape really sets the scene in telling the hard lifestyle of the men of the gold seeker era, and with Peter's involvement, a nice link right up to the modern generation.
It was a moving experience for me because I was then in the role of a person who was, you were Chinese, but you were living in a European country, and it was the difference in the two cultures, that being able to portray the part of somebody who had accepted, right, New Zealand was home, it was not going to change, and trying to explain that to the main character who was very much Chinese and wanted to go home.
Peter worked hard throughout his schooling and graduated from Otago University with a law degree. From his law firm in Mosgiel, Peter began to get involved in local government. This involvement escalated, and in 2004, the majority of Dunedin people voted Peter in as mayor of the city. He was to hold this position for 2 terms until 2010. This was a very proud moment for Otago Chinese.
There was a pride because I was the 3rd Chinese mayor in New Zealand. You don't do these things because you think that everybody's going to be proud of you, but it's a side benefit of that suddenly that people saw me as, right, you're a kind of a Chinese leader within the European community. And that wasn't the way that I looked at things until I just saw myself, right, I was just a Dunedin boy who's lived here all his life and who's enjoyed doing the things that I've done, and thought, okay, how can I keep on doing the things I like doing and can contribute? I suppose I saw that with our sister city in Shanghai. The Shanghai people thought this was kind of wonderful. In fact, I think they were probably more proud of me than the people of Dunedin were.
During Peter's early life, Dunedin had become the centre of Chinese activity in the south. In the hinterland, once buzzing with the activity of Chinese, no Chinese lived anymore. What was left were the remnants of a nearly forgotten generation.